How's it going, everybody? Welcome to LongtinArt. My name is Dan Longton, and today we're going to be talking about overpainting techniques. You may have seen in one of my previous videos, we talked about the imprimatura or umber layer technique, and today we're going to discuss that a little bit further and move on to the overpainting and colorization layers. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about when you're working in overpainting techniques and layering. One thing that I do want to make clear is that when I paint, I always work in layers. I never paint all the way through, including details and color accuracy and all of that in one layer. It just doesn't make the process as enjoyable for me. And it really doesn't help someone who's trying to learn painting all that much to try to get all of that detail in the first layer. So today we're actually going to be talking about some of the details of these next subsequent layers after you get your drawing and imprimatura down, regardless of what technique that you use, whether it's a bistre, whether it's a grisaille, whether it's an umber layer or a verdaccio. All of these techniques can be used in any of these underpaintings. But today we're actually going to be talking about, and I'm going to do a demonstration here shortly on the umber technique of imprimatura, where it's just a brown umber layer, and I basically get my values down by thinning the umber and moving on, letting it dry, and now we're in the colorization process. So on these first layers, after you get it all painted, that umber layer, don't try to match colors in the first layer to exactly match the object or that you're trying to paint, the subject that you're trying to paint. It should be a slowing building process. Now, these first layers, I usually try to focus on generalization and local color, but I'm really not focusing on saturation levels. When we talk about the three levels of three dimensions of color, there's hue, saturation, and value. Really, on these first layers, I'm only focusing on hue, which is the localization color, if it's orange or red or green, and the value that it holds. I'm not trying to match the saturation values whatsoever because I know that I'm going to be working up to those saturated values as well as highlights. So I'm trying to build up to details, and I usually do that through a few stages of layering and painting. And with that said, I also try to lean my students towards not getting wrapped up in the details yet. Um, as you progress through and you work in these stages of layering and working up the saturation to the highlight and the details, I always like to use like the analogy of building a house. You don't really start hanging pictures and putting dishes in the cupboards when the cupboards haven't been painted. You don't really start hanging pictures on the walls when the insulation isn't up, the sheetrock isn't up. You have to start with the foundation. You start with the after that, you do the 2x4 shell. After that, you start running electrical cord, putting your outlets in and your switches. You put your insulation and the outside of the house in, and you get all this stuff put together. And once the house is completely ready and the carpet and the tile and all that stuff in, that's when you start putting, you start moving in. So to me, that's kind of like the details layer. You don't start putting things into the home like you're going to live there until the home is done being built. And that's what these layers of underpainting and kind of overpainting do, is they build up to these details. So what I like to do is I use larger brushes, medium sized to larger brushes in these first layers, because it restricts me from keeping, details out of my mind. It restricts me into thinking I don't really, it forces me not to put details in, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So try not to get so wrapped up in matching the color perfectly on the first layer, and definitely avoid high amounts of detail in these first couple of layers, because you're just going to have to do it again. You're going to have to adjust. You're going to have to, make little small adjustments and things like that that are just going to have to be done over and over again. And in that sense that you kind of you kind of chase your tail and go around in circles, that you just have to do what you've already done. So it's almost like working back to front. And that's a good thing to say, is that I always work backwards in the background towards the foreground, no matter what I'm painting. Just because in that sense I'm not really chasing my tail. If it's just a natural way of working, so that you're always painting on top of things as opposed to going back and having to repaint. A couple of things to note in these first couple of layers is that uh, you're going to find that certain colors are transparent, more so than others. And even sometimes when you squeeze out a tube of paint, no matter what the brand is and the manufacturer, some colors are loaded with oil. Now, if you buy student grade paint, you're probably going to get this more often than not. And it's not that it's a bad thing. You just have to mix the tube. So if you're squeezing your tube of paint and a lot of excess oil comes out, it probably means that the tube is separated and it's sat on the shelf too long, either in the store or maybe it's in your palette. It's a color you haven't used that much. You really just want to squeeze the tube back and forth and really get it worked back in and kind of mix back up together. But after you do that, you may even find that certain colors are going to be way more transparent than others. The biggest color that comes to mind in my mind is a blue, and it's ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue is a very, very transparent color. Now, most manufacturers will have like a little square that'll either be filled with black, or it'll be white, or it'll have a line through it that's black, a black triangle and a white triangle. And this indicates whether the color is opaque, semi-opaque, or transparent. And some colors are going to be very much transparent just because of the natural attributes that the pigment has. Like ultramarine blue, it's a very, very transparent color. And what I'm talking about is trying to maintain, keeping the idea that let the paint be what the paint is. Don't try to make a color opaque if it doesn't need to be opaque. And if you're trying to make it opaque, maybe it's better to work in layers as opposed to laying down a thick layer and trying to get it completely opaque on that first go. It's always better to do, thin layers as opposed to one thick layer. Okay, and think in layers to build, like building that house, that you have to go in stages to build up to those details anyway. So, colors should not be exactly the same either. When you're working in layers, I already mentioned this, but these layers that are going to be very opaque and very transparent, if layers that if you're trying to make something very ultramarine blue, and you'll find that as you move through stages of painting, that let's say that your first layer you put down a straight ultramarine blue is kind of like, and it's pretty thin, and it's kind of letting the underpainting bleed through, and you want it more opaque. I tend to not to go through the same color of paint over another layer. Like if I painted the first layer ultramarine blue, I try to avoid putting ultramarine blue straight on in the same spots, because it will become a very flat and very opaque kind of layer. And working in layers, you kind of cut down the luminosity of that underpainting layer when you really making a color opaque. I usually don't use opaque colors until the very last layer. Like the really bursting cadmium yellows and cadmium reds and things like that are really just going to pop. Like titanium white for highlights. Those are usually the last thing that go on, and they're very, very small amounts of real opaque paint. And I usually let the paint be paint, in the sense that I let that transparency come through and allow that underlying layer to come through a lot of the times. And not only that, when you work in layers, it allows you to retain the saturation levels of even these transparent colors. And what I mean by that is, if you're trying to build up and you're mixing colors, like say, a violet or even an orange, a secondary color, and you really want the saturation to be as high as possible, when you work into wet, meaning that you've got a layer down, and rather than letting it dry before you put another layer over it, if it's wet into wet, meaning you're applying wet paint from the brush into wet paint on the canvas, these colors are going to mix on the canvas, and it's going to knock down the saturation. And this has to do with what's called subtractive color mixing. And subtractive color mixing is when you mix two colors together in paint. Your primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, and any two of those colors are the primary to create a secondary, like an orange of a red and a yellow as your primary to make orange. The red and the yellow by itself is a higher saturation amount than when you mix those two together to create a secondary. And that's what it means by subtractive, is you're actually knocking down the saturation by more. The more you mix, the lower the saturation gets. Hence, that when you take red, yellow, and blue and you mix it together, you're going to get a mud or a gray kind of tone, and it knocks it all down. Light does not work that way, and it works off of a RGB spectrum as opposed to a red, green, and blue spectrum, as opposed to a red, blue, and yellow spectrum. When you mix all of the colors of light together, you get white light, and that's an additive process of color mixing. So it's a little bit different. So if you want to maintain a level of saturation, it's better to work in layers anyway, because overmixing creates a mud. And that's why in the first layer, I kind of don't really think about trying to match my colors perfectly, because I'm building up to that layer of saturated color. So in that first color, you might have heard me say in a Verdaccio, the dead layer. Well, I've also in art historical books from the Flemish masters that I've read, that term is kind of loosely used, not necessarily in the term dead layer, but dead color. That your first layer, you want to leave space to where your color can go. So you really don't want to use that high saturated color at the beginning stages of colorizing your painting, knowing that you want to be up there at the end of the painting. So in the sense, these Flemish dead layers or dead colors are colors that the saturation has been knocked down and muted, knowing that a layer will go over that layer and build up to saturation. And it's easy to do. You can add a gray to the color, or even your earth tone ochres, like your yellow ochre, your burnt sienna. That's a yellow ochre is a earthy yellow. Burnt sienna is an earthy red. And, and these really knock down the saturation really quickly, but it still keeps the localized, generalized color of whatever it is you're trying to paint. So really in that first layer, you only focus on value and generalized local colors in that layer, and then bump up the color selectively in the subsequent layers to get that level of saturation that you're trying to achieve. And then also that you start off with larger brushes. And when you start off with larger brushes, it kind of keeps your detail down. But, when you think of layers as that first, if you kind of think about it like in a triangle, that first layer is an underpainting. It's really loose. There's not a whole lot of detail. And as you go through layer upon layer, it kind of brings it down to a point. And that last layer, you're really getting out your double aughts or your aughts and adding little highlights and, maybe hair strands in a portrait painting or something like that. So I'm going to start painting. I'm going to show you my video. I've worked on it for a couple of days now. I think this is my second colorized layer. And the first layer, again, I didn't really think about accurate color mixing. The second day, or details in the first layer. And the second day, I really start to kind of focus more on tightening up the first layer and leaning towards color accuracy. Not really focusing on details yet, but that's going to be in the next layer. And I also, in the project that we're doing, I had you get an object, and mine is a Pez dispenser of Garfield. I actually set the object next to my palette and try to mix and match colors based on the object rather than the photograph. This is why I wanted you guys to get an inorganic object so that you can start practicing color mixing to the actual object itself. Now, when you work in a still life, working from a photograph is completely different, and we're going to do that later. But that's where we're at. I'm at day 2, and this is about 4 hours into it, and I'm definitely going to be adding another at the end of this video. I'll add another one in later on after I paint tonight, this evening, what I'm going through. So yeah, let's just I'm going to go ahead and switch over, and we're going to talk about what colors I'm using in terms of this palette, and we'll go from there. Let's get going.